What's up, everybody? So today we're going to be doing a quick, simple video on how to remember what you read and what you learn. As you guys know, I've been reading a lot more recently, and over the past few years, I've slowly and steadily increased the volume that I both read physically and consume via other forms of media, such as audiobooks and podcasts. And one of the issues that I kind of ran into is I was experiencing information overload. So not only do we every day read and listen to thousands and thousands of words and bits of media from Instagram posts, Twitter posts, Facebook posts. Advertising is just ridiculously bombarding our brains, whether that's TV advertising or billboard advertising. And so our brains are overstimulated and therefore desensitized due to this ridiculous amount of information that we are hammered with. And although when we're reading a book or listening to a podcast or listening to something we actually care about, our brains don't necessarily automatically flip into this I'm going to remember this now mode. And so we kind of come up with a problem that our brain, we may be awake for 18 hours a day consuming media 15, 16, 17 of those hours, and our brain kind of just retains only a little bit, only certain bits that are usually associated with high emotion or that are reprogrammed in over and over and over that our brain will actually remember. So today I'm going to go over a few steps here on how we can learn better and how we can remember what we've read. So the first step is to kind of prime your brain before you dive in. So if you're reading a book, I would recommend that you first go online and read a quick summary of the book. That way you can kind of get an idea of what you're going to be going into when you first dive in. Then I'm going to recommend that you skim the book, maybe read over the chapter headlines and prime your brain for what it's looking for, especially if we're talking about the self-help type books that you're less interested in the story and you're more interested in getting the information out. You might be able to skim the book for what you're looking for, get a few bits of information out that are necessary for you and that are interesting to your particular life, your particular situation, and therefore are more likely to stick in your brain. So that'd be tip one, is to preview and skim, and that may be all you need to do. You might not even need to fully read the book, but if you do want to read the book, these pre-actions will help you to retain a lot more once you do go ahead and read the book. So the second seems a little obvious, but when you're reading, you need to focus and put yourself in a situation where you're not distracted. Get rid of your phone, go in a quiet, comfortable location. If you have coffee or whatever with you, and sit down and just read the book, enjoy the book, and try and get into it. Try and feel the characters, but focus on your reading in the moment and focus on enjoying that activity and blocking everything else out. And the third tip is once you finish the book, you're going to want to do two things. The first is to actually try your own summary. So whether you write it down or you just say it, although writing is definitely better, you can type it out. And it can be a couple sentences long, paragraph long, page long, maybe 6 or 7 pages, depending on how much time you have, how much you enjoyed the book, and how much you really want to retain this information in the long term. You can write this summary, and then I'd recommend you look up a separate summary of the book, that's been published, that's been vetted by someone, and compare your summaries. See if there's things you missed, and try and then redo your summary possibly, or enhance points here and there. Then you've always got this 1 or 2 pages that you wrote on your own. They're your own words. They're what was important to you. You can go back and look at if you ever want to glean more information out of this book. Tip number 4 is really, really important because this is connecting to when I talked about the emotion that you feel. So when you're reading something, visualize it. Visualize constantly. If you're reading a fiction book and it talks about the guy walking through the woods, picture the guy in the woods, picture the woods, and not just, a stereotypical tree or whatever. Picture everything, the bark, the smells, the sounds, get all those senses involved, so it's not just visualization as in what you would see, it's really sensualization as in get all those senses involved. And when you do that, you really get into the story, you activate the parts of your brain that are related to emotion and to sensing, and you're going to lock this memory in a much, much stronger way. You're also going to create more cues for your mind to remember it, because you might smell something that kind of smells like that, and all of a sudden you're remembering this book, which can seem a little weird, but that's really how your brain works. So the fifth tip, and this is one that I've implemented on my own and that really helped me, is to actually go out and do it. So it could be a fiction book and you hear something that's interesting. It could be a self-help book and you find a point that you think you could apply to your life well. Well, actually go out and do it. There's a few books that I've read that I've decided, taken a point from the book and gone and ran with it. And that's now a point that I'm never going to forget because, it actually played out in my life. And I actually, did this thing that I read from the book. And now it's a part of me. It's a part of me, instead of being a part of the book. So, for example, I read Ultra Learning, really good book, talks a lot about, the learning process. And I decided to implement that learning process into becoming a better public speaker. But by actually performing the steps in this book, I probably couldn't rattle off, I remember there were 9, I probably couldn't rattle off all 9, but I could rattle off the process of first planning and then actually diving in and doing whatever action you wanted to create, and then retesting your places to see where your issues are, drilling those skills, and then kind of moving on and deciding, well, now that I've learned this and done this, what fully did I learn from the experience, and re-summarizing it to yourself. So another idea that kind of goes along with doing is actually teaching. And although they might seem similar on the surface, your brain has to understand something so well to be able to teach it that you can trick yourself, but you can't trick someone else. See what I'm saying? And so to convey understanding to someone else, you have to understand it very, very well yourself. And I've utilized this often with my brother. I will, try and teach him the things from the book, talk about it, and you see your own gaps very quickly. Well, you can't articulate this point, and you realize you don't actually understand it, not to the level that you need to. The 6th tip is to teach to other people whenever you're given the opportunity. And it's also something that you'll feel good about in yourself is oh yeah, I'm a mentor, I get to help someone else out. So that's a very, very important, is to convey what you understand to someone else. The next tip, which kind of goes along with doing and teaching, is actually discussing. So it's a little different than summarizing. It's where you get someone who has also read the book or maybe understands the ideas, or this can apply to podcasts or whatever you want to learn. Find someone who's got some kind of understanding of what's going on, and you just have a conversation, a free-form, flowing conversation. And this actually mimics good thinking. I heard in a Jordan Peterson book or audio podcast or whatever, he talked about thinking as actually a conversation between part of your brain and another part of your brain, where you present a hypothesis and then the other part of your brain kind of tests that hypothesis, and then you, via that process of thinking, reveal better truth. Well, a better way to do that oftentimes is with a conversation with another person, because they're not just you, they don't have just your experiences, so 2 people, twice as powerful. When you guys discuss the topic and dive into the, whether it's the details or the big picture, you get a better understanding of what you think about it, what they think about it, and you're here and they're here, but together through this conversation, you'll rise up together and both of you get to a better place of understanding. But this discussion it's not an argument, and it's a good distinction that I'd like to make here, is you need to search for what is correct, not necessarily you yourself trying to prove your idea correct. So you might be wrong at the beginning, but at the end you're more right or closer to the truth. Another great way to get more out of what you read or what you learn is to reconsume that media at a later point. How did you learn your times tables when you were a kid? You said them over and over and over and over. Although this can sound kind of counterintuitive, why would I reread something? Well, not only are you going to gain things that you didn't gain the time before, because your brain already has an intuitive understanding of what's going on, so you're going to then get that second or that third layer of meaning from this book or podcast or post or article or whatever you're reading. And by rereading it, you're going to reignite the important points that you already remembered. You'll be like, oh yes, I love that. Maybe some more motivation or just another second enjoyable experience. But you're also going to find those deeper layers of meaning. And this happened with me. There's a couple books that I've read multiple times. How to Win Friends and Influence People, I've read or listened to on 2 or 3 different times. And as I read through it the second or the third time, it's a simple book. It doesn't talk about any radical ideas, but you remember constantly call people by their names. And that's just something that stuck out to me really well the second time. And so now I'm in an internship, and we have a directory that allows us to see everybody's name on our computer. And I kind of have that up on my computer at all times. So I'm constantly scrolling through, it's got their picture. So picture, face, got the name. Okay. Then I call them by their name. They're happy that I say that. I learn it a little better. I'm that much more charismatic, that much more likable than if I hadn't reread this book. If I just read it the first time, I'd forgotten that. The last tip that I would have is to consume different media forms than you're consuming right now. So if you're learning only through lectures, try and read. If you're learning only through reading, listen to an audiobook. If you're learning only through visual, looking at pictures and doing, maybe try and teach. But as you integrate these different ways of learning together and different forms of consumption, you're going to figure out what works best for your own brain. I'm definitely a visual learner, visual and kinesthetic learner. Working through a task, I get much more out of it than any other form. But I realized that I'm actually also an auditory learner, and I've been able to leverage that to consume an incredible amount of audiobooks and podcasts, and therefore, I've changed driving and exercising into learning experiences, and it's something that makes those experiences for me more enjoyable, and I glean so much information from them. And I know a lot of people who don't like audiobooks, and that's fine. If you're not an audiobook person, that's totally fine. I don't get that much from reading nonfiction, uninteresting things. So if I'm reading a book, actually physically reading it, I'm going to want it to have a story, have characters, and that way I can dive in and visualize it. But if I'm listening to something, I'm totally fine with it being, quote unquote boring. Because audio requires a little bit less active engagement as reading, I'm able to use more of my brain to process that, come up with scenarios in my mind like, this is what they're saying in the audio program. Oh, this makes sense to this part of my life. Because it requires less mental power to listen for me than it does to read, I'm able to utilize that to get more out of nonfiction, self-help or philosophy books. Versus when I read, I really love reading fiction, enjoyable, or, story, kind of like, when I physically read autobiographies or, a little bit more interesting, it's got to have a story. I've got to be able to dive in and visualize it. So when I'm listening to those audiobooks, I'm actually visualizing myself in those situations. And, that just comes from consuming different forms of media. You might find, a very visually instructive form like graphs, and you realize that you like to read and get things off of, articles that have graphs and pictures, and you glean a lot more out of that than you would from books or audio. The idea is to experiment with different sources of consuming your information. In summary, it's attacking the project of reading by not just reading. Yes, you want to focus on reading when you're reading, but you also want to preview that material a little bit, summarize it yourself, and then talk about it with other people, but also dive in and do it. Do whatever you learn. You read a book and they talk about, this type of coffee that they made. Go make that coffee. Or you read a book about traveling, go travel. And so by doing those experiences, by teaching things to people, and then by being a little experimental and always trying new things based on what you've read and what you've learned, your brain is going to realize that information is important and hold on to it infinitely better. I hope you guys learned a little something from this video. For those of you who watched through to the end, I'm going to say it along with me. Reading is knowledge. Knowledge is power. So reading is power. Like, comment, subscribe. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you again for making it to the end.